For 3 years, Moscow prepared for the wrong American weapon. It prepared for another crate of artillery shells, another Patriot interceptor shipment, another televised announcement from Washington. It did not prepare for the moment the United States quietly switched back on the invisible machinery that turned scattered Ukrainian attacks into a coordinated strike system. Russia expected a pause. What emerged instead was a reactivated American-enabled kill chain, reinforced by renewed intelligence sharing, hardened long-range munitions, and a methodical campaign against the very radars, relays, and missile batteries that keep Russian rear areas alive. On March 11, 2025, Washington and Kyiv confirmed that U.S. intelligence sharing and security assistance had resumed after talks in Jeddah. 2 days later, Reuters reported that upgraded ground-launched small-diameter bombs, the GLSDB system, were heading back into the fight after modifications designed to resist Russian jamming. That sequence looked bureaucratic on paper. On the battlefield, it looked like the sudden return of a weapon Russia thought it had already neutralized. The secret was not merely a bomb. The secret was the restoration of an entire architecture. The images, the strike timings, the target selection, the electronic warfare mapping, and the post-strike assessment all began to align again. And when that happens in modern war, the side that notices last usually pays first. The evidence of that shift does not begin in Washington. It begins in the dead space behind Russian lines, where air defense crews, logistics officers, and drone operators suddenly discover that rear areas are no longer rear areas. It begins in places that had once felt comfortably outside the daily danger radius. Taganrog in Rostov Oblast, Kapustin Yar in Astrakhan Oblast, Votkinsk in Udmurtia, and the radar belt stretched across occupied Crimea, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, and the approaches to the Black Sea. The pattern is unmistakable. Ukrainian planners are no longer simply trying to hit what is visible. They are trying to open corridors through what is supposed to be protected. They are striking the eyes before the fist, the relay before the drone swarm, the launcher before the missile salvo, and the warehouse before the offensive even begins. That is why the term secret weapon is not mere theater here. Russia did not fail to recognize a single missile type. Russia failed to recognize that the American contribution was becoming less visible and more dangerous at the same time, because intelligence, electronic resilience, and targeting discipline do not leave dramatic contrails. They leave strategic paralysis. The chronology matters. On March 11, 2025, after more than 8 hours of talks in Jeddah, the United States and Ukraine stated that American intelligence sharing and military assistance would resume. The same reporting noted that Ukraine had launched a major overnight drone attack on Russia and that 337 drones were downed over Russian territory in a single wave. Then, on March 13th, Reuters reported that the United States was poised to resume shipments of GLSDB munitions after a set of technical upgrades. 19 test rounds had reportedly been fired in recent weeks to evaluate those modifications. The changes focused in part on reinforcing connections inside the weapon so it could better survive the kind of Russian electronic attack that had previously degraded performance. This mattered because the GLSDB had offered Ukraine something urgently needed after stocks of ATACMS reportedly dwindled, a 100-mile or 161-kilometer strike option assembled from a GBU-39 small-diameter bomb and an M26 rocket motor, a hybrid design able to glide around terrain and known air defenses once released. In theory, that gave Ukraine an economical way to hit supply lines, staging areas, and command nodes beyond the 43-mile or 69-kilometer reach of the GMLRS rockets most associated with HIMARS. In practice, Russian jamming had blunted the weapon. But that is exactly what makes the March reactivation so important, because a weapon that returns after adaptation is often more dangerous than a weapon used successfully from the start. It arrives carrying data about failure, and data about failure is how invisible weapons evolve. This is where the technical picture becomes decisive. A GLSDB is not spectacular because of raw explosive weight. Its real value lies in geometry, affordability, and network logic. By mating the airdropped GBU-39 to the rocket motor of the older M26, the system creates a ground-launched precision glide bomb capable of reaching targets at ranges that complicate Russian defensive calculations without demanding the scarce inventory associated with ATACMS. Its small wings extend after launch. Its flight path can be shaped. Its navigation package gives planners options against terrain and known threat envelopes. Yet modern precision is only as good as its resistance to disruption. Russian forces have spent the war saturating sectors with electronic warfare, jamming radios, GPS-guided munitions, and drones alike. They have used that same logic against Excalibur rounds, against Ukrainian unmanned systems, and against the earlier GLSDB batches. So when Reuters revealed that recent test shots had been used to verify anti-jamming upgrades, the real significance was not merely that another munition was available. The significance was that the United States and its industrial base were learning in direct contact with Russian electromagnetic warfare and then feeding that adaptation back into the battle space. That is not a shipment. That is a live competition in the invisible spectrum. And Russia's problem is that once the American side treats electronic warfare not as a supporting issue but as the center of the problem, every Russian radar, jammer, and command relay becomes both a shield and a beacon. The deeper logic of this campaign was described with unusual clarity by CSIS. In its analysis of the state of the Ukraine war, CSIS argued that Ukraine now possesses a strike system integrating Western and Ukrainian intelligence, weapons, and post-strike assessments in a rolling attack against Russia's strategic military production and energy infrastructure with secondary focus on missile and drone launch and storage sites. That description should stop every viewer for a moment, because it means the secret weapon is not a missile alone. It is the loop. Intelligence identifies a vulnerability. Penetration activity probes the air defense network. A strike package tests a route. Post-strike assessment measures what was destroyed, what fired back, which radars illuminated, which frequencies jammed, which decoys worked, and which gaps widened. Then the next attack is built from the memory of the previous one. CSIS also noted that Ukrainian planners and NATO supporters continuously examine the entire Russian air defense system to identify weaknesses and facilitate strikes on strategic targets inside Russia. In other words, Russia is not just being attacked. Russia is being studied during the attack, after the attack, and because of the attack. But that is still only the first layer of the story, because once the corridor is opened, the real damage begins far behind the point of impact. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Ukraine has imposed increasing challenges on Russian forces at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels since the beginning of 2026. ISW described how Ukrainian drone units increasingly shifted their focus away from merely hunting infantry and toward destroying artillery, drone operators, ground lines of communication, staging areas, and communications antennas in the near rear. That shift matters because it attacks the conditions that make offensive action possible. A Russian assault can replace men. It cannot easily replace coordination, ammunition timing, and protected routes. ISW cited Ukrainian reporting that monthly mid-range strikes from 50 to 250 kilometers behind the front had quadrupled from an average of roughly 11 between March and October 2025 to about 45 since November 2025. It also noted Ukrainian General Staff data indicating that 55 Russian air defense systems were struck during winter 2025 to 2026, followed by 23 more between March 1st and March 16th, for a total of 80 systems during winter and early spring. Those numbers are not trivia. They describe systematic battlefield air interdiction and a deliberate suppression and destruction of enemy air defenses campaign, the kind of effort militaries usually abbreviate as SEED and DEAD. Once that pattern is understood, the scattered explosions in Russian-held territory no longer look scattered. They look sequenced. Ukraine's own Ministry of Defense filled in the map with striking specificity. Between March 1st and March 15, 2026, it said Ukrainian forces hit more than 20 targets supporting Russian air defense. The list was not symbolic, it was technical and geographic, exactly the way serious targeting lists are supposed to be. Pantsir S-1 systems were struck in Yakimivka and Novozern. Tor systems were hit in Volnovakha and Balashivka. A Tor M1 was targeted in Korobkin. An S-300 launcher was struck near Strilkov. Buk M3 and Buk M1 systems were hit in Lymanchuk and Bahativka. An S-300V launcher was hit in Borovenki. Even an S-400 Triumph launcher was struck near Dalny in Crimea. The same Ukrainian account listed radar assets tied to S-300 and S-400 systems across Mangush, Sadov, Chervone, Novokrasnivka, Sevastopol, and Novorossiysk, along with Podlet 1K, Kasta 2E2, Yastreb AV, Sopka 2, Niboyu, Protivnik, Parol, and Valdai systems. It also mentioned a ground relay station in Chornomorsky. a communications tower in Primorsk, and an electronic warfare station near Donetsk. This is what dismantling an integrated air defense system looks like in practice. It is rarely one dramatic blast. It is the patient removal of sensors, launchers, communications nodes, and jammers until the map of protection begins to resemble Swiss cheese. And when that happens, a reintroduced long-range bomb is no longer flying into a solid wall. It is flying through a corridor created in pieces. Now the campaign expands beyond air defense and into the industrial bloodstream of the Russian war machine. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense stated that during January and February 2026, its forces struck 3 major Russian defense industry enterprises, a key missile test range, and 2 large arsenals. On January 13th, Ukrainian-made missiles reportedly hit Atlant Aero in Taganrog, a facility linked to Molniya attack and reconnaissance drones and components for Orion systems. On February 5th, Ukrainian strikes reportedly damaged a technical facility, assembly building, and logistics warehouse at the Kapustin Yar State Central Interservice Missile Test Range in Astrakhan Oblast, a site associated with testing advanced missiles including Oreshnik. On February 12th, a Gryu storage arsenal near Kotluban in Volgograd Oblast was struck, producing secondary detonations after attacks carried out with FP-5 Flamingo long-range strike systems, according to the same ministry statement. Around Rostov-on-Don, a drone storage site was reportedly hit on February 9th, destroying about 6,000 FPV drones. In Michurinsk, the Progress plant that supplies high-technology equipment for aviation and missile systems was struck. On February 21st, Votkinsky Zavod, a major missile production enterprise, was hit, with Ukraine claiming destruction of Workshop Number 22. The ministry said the plant produces RS-24 Yars and Yars-S intercontinental ballistic missiles, R-30 Bulava submarine-launched missiles, Iskander-M ballistic missiles, and Kinzhal-associated systems. At this point, the story is no longer about harassment. It is about strategic recursion. The same network that studies Russian defenses is being used to degrade the factories, depots, and test ranges that replenish them. That is the moment when Russia's unpreparedness becomes truly dangerous, because the next offensive may be losing strength before it is even launched. One more detail reveals why the Russian side was so exposed when this network accelerated. Russian planners had spent much of the war learning how to jam, spoof, and intercept the obvious Western tools. They studied satellite navigation signatures. They adapted to HIMARS patterns. They dispersed depots after ATAC-MS strikes. They built narratives around red lines and assumed that visible escalation would be politically telegraphed long before it became operationally decisive. But a fused strike architecture does not announce itself that way. It advances quietly through restored intelligence channels, software updates, anti-jam hardening, better frequency discipline, and a more ruthless target hierarchy. By the time operators in the field notice the change, the learning cycle is already running faster than their defensive adaptation. This is why rear area hits matter more than headline-grabbing frontline footage. A frontline explosion proves vulnerability. A rear area explosion proves miscalculation. And a strike on the systems that were supposed to prevent that explosion proves doctrinal failure. That is the real meaning of unpreparedness here. It is not that Russia had no air defenses, no electronic warfare, or no warning. It is that Russia prepared for a familiar pattern of Western support, and instead encountered a more integrated, more resilient, and more forensic form of warfighting. There is a larger geopolitical meaning here, and it is easy to miss if attention stays trapped at the level of individual explosions. The United States did not merely resume aid. It helped restore a model of war in which software, sensing, industrial adaptation, and allied intelligence convert limited inventories into disproportionate strategic effects. Russia, by contrast, has often approached this war as a contest of volume, attrition, and intimidation. That approach still matters. Russia can mass drones, artillery, and manpower on a scale Ukraine struggles to match. CSIS cited Ukrainian military intelligence estimates that Russia can produce around 35,000 Shahed drones per year and may reach 40,000 by 2030. It also described a frontline kill zone extending 15 kilometers, where vehicle movement becomes difficult to impossible and infantry must march 10 to 15 kilometers to positions. But even in such an environment, the side that learns faster in the electromagnetic and targeting domain can distort the opponent's advantages. The American role fits that logic. Intelligence sharing resumption on March 11th was not a symbolic diplomatic gesture. In a drone-saturated war, intelligence is route selection, frequency awareness, timing discipline, target prioritization, decoy management, and battle damage assessment. It is the difference between throwing metal at a fortress and finding the unlocked service entrance. That is why Moscow's strategic discomfort has grown sharper each time Western support becomes less visible and more integrated. There is also a psychological dimension that matters as much as the hardware. A Russian radar crew in Crimea, a drone logistics officer in Rostov, or a plant manager in Votkinsk does not experience these events as abstract policy shifts. They experience them as the collapse of distance. Rear areas no longer feel rear. Protected systems no longer feel protected. Each destroyed radar means someone did not see in time. Each damaged jammer means someone trusted the spectrum and was betrayed by it. Each strike on a warehouse, relay, or missile plant tells thousands of officers, workers, and local officials that the war has begun to reach into the spaces that propaganda had marked as secure. ISW noted that Ukrainian strikes on communications antennas have a demoralizing effect on Russian forces while inhibiting frontline communications. That detail is more revealing than it first appears. Armies break not only when they lose equipment, but when they lose the expectation that equipment will arrive, orders will connect, and invisible systems will keep functioning in the background. The most unsettling weapon in modern war is often not the one that kills the most on a given day. It is the one that convinces the other side that nowhere is truly outside the cycle of observation, targeting, and follow-on attack. But there is an even more consequential question approaching now, and it may determine how this entire phase of the war is remembered. If this American-enabled strike architecture continues to mature, then the next months will not be defined only by what Ukraine destroys. They will be defined by what Russia is forced to defend, relocate, disperse, harden, or stop producing. Every S-400 launcher pulled back to protect a rear area node is one fewer asset confidently shaping the frontline battle space. Every radar moved, every depot fragmented, every drone storage site redistributed, and every production line interrupted imposes hidden costs on Russian operational tempo. A force preparing spring and summer campaigns depends on synchronized artillery preparation, protected staging areas, reliable logistics, communications redundancy, and confidence that key assets can survive long enough to be useful. ISW has already assessed that Ukrainian strikes in the near rear are degrading Russia's ability to prepare artillery for anticipated spring-summer offensives. If the reopened American loop continues feeding upgraded munitions, better intelligence, and more precise post-strike learning into that campaign, then what looks today like a series of daring raids may harden into an operational method. The future danger for Moscow is not a single spectacular weapon reveal, it is normalization. Once deep strike becomes routine, Russian military geography changes. Factories, arsenals, air defense belts, and launch sites all begin operating under continuous uncertainty. And in strategic terms, uncertainty is cumulative attrition. That is why the title of this story is less exaggerated than it first appears. The secret weapon was not hidden because it was fictional. It was hidden because it was easy to misunderstand. Many observers looked for a silver bullet and missed the return of the system that makes ordinary weapons more lethal, more survivable, and more strategically coherent. On March 11, 2025, intelligence sharing resumed. On March 13th, upgraded anti-jam GLSDBs were reported as returning. By March 2026, Ukraine and outside analysts were describing a campaign that had already struck dozens of Russian air defense assets, quadrupled certain mid-range strike patterns, and reached deep into missile, drone, and industrial infrastructure. The contradiction from the beginning now closes in full. Russia prepared for visible American escalation. It was not prepared for invisible American integration. The battlefield did not change because one exotic device appeared from nowhere. It changed because intelligence, resilience, targeting, and adaptation re-entered the war as a combined weapon. The audience can leave its judgment in the comments, because the next phase will likely decide whether this was a temporary disruption or the opening of a much broader unraveling. What is already clear is that Russia was not surprised by noise. It was surprised by precision. And in this war, precision is the quiet form of shock. The next Russian commander who assumes geography alone provides safety may discover that the deadliest American weapon in this war is coordinated knowledge itself, presented by TGN. Thank you for choosing us.